Hey folks, I decided to go right back to the beginning of card magic, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. All you had to know or master were 4 moves in order to be called a card magician or an entertainer. Back in the days of Hofzinser and Houdin, even Max Malini, these moves were the mainstay of card magic. And the 4 moves you needed to know was the classic pass, the classic palm, the change, and the classic force. Now, a lot of magicians know these moves, especially when you've been around card magic for a few years, and you tend to think, oh, I know these moves, I don't need to learn these moves, oh, I know everything about these moves, but not really. How many of those moves have you truly mastered? How many would you say you can do whenever, wherever, and won't arouse suspicion at all? I don't think there are very many of you that could do all 4 of these moves. Even me, myself, I work on these moves occasionally, trying to polish them as much as I can. Did you know that all the card tricks back then, late 1800s, early 1900s, only used those 4 moves? All the variations in card tricks only used those 4 moves. And that's why Houdini was fooled with a double lift, because a double lift is actually a pretty new thing. And that's how Dave Vernon managed to fool Houdini with a double lift using an ambitious card routine, because Houdini thought he knew everything. So please, don't have an ego. There's nothing worse in magic. A lot of magicians have egos because they get all the ooh, ah, that's amazing from the lay people that they perform for. And then they start believing that what they're doing is actual magic or actually amazing. And how many of you, admit it, how many of you that do magic, especially card magic, how many of you could say that 99% or even 100% of the stuff isn't even stuff you've invented or created on your own? You might have put things together to make routines look like yours or feel like yours, or adjusted routines. But how many moves, how many completely unique tricks have you honestly come up with by yourself? I bet you there's a big percentage of you that don't do anything original. You might put things together in your own way, but that doesn't mean you've invented the moves or the concept for the trick, the plots. So please, there's nothing worse than a big ego in magic where I know everything, or I'm me. Okay? There's nothing worse than that. You've got to be humble. Don't take yourself too seriously. Respect your audience, and you'll go a long way. So let's start with the pass. This is what a perfect pass looks like.
One signature moment in it. We may
just kidding. We all know what a classic pass is, and if you don't, you haven't been in magic for very long. A classic pass is where a spectator puts a card back into the pack, and then you cut the pack, bringing their card to the top or the bottom, depending. But the classic pass, more often than not, brings the spectator's card to the top, and it's a cut. Now, most magicians think that the cut should be invisible even if people are staring at it, but that's not the case. You've got to worry about smoothness and not speed. And the reason for that is you got to do it when people aren't looking. You got to do it on the offbeat. You've got to be good with crowd management. So when the crowd's attention is relaxed, that's when you do the classic pass. And that's not something you can practice at home. All you can practice at home is the smoothness of the classic pass. That's all you can practice, making it smooth. The smoother it is, the faster it will become. And therefore, when you do it in that offbeat, it won't be noticed. That's when your hand doesn't make those big jerky movements that you see, where your hands remain stationary and you can actually execute the pass, so that there's not this weird movement in people's periphery, their peripheral vision. So let's get into a couple of pointers in the pass. I'm not going to teach you the entire pass, classic pass from the beginning. There's lots on YouTube and the internet about the classic pass, but I'll just give you a few tips and pointers, and then we'll move on to the next one of the 4 workhorses in card magic. Okay, so you've had a spectator's card returned to the pack, and you've got a break above their card like this. Okay, you wait for the ideal time to do the pass during your patter when the concentration has relaxed, so you can be relaxed with the pack. And when it's time to do the pass, what I like to do, a lot of magicians like to grip the top half of the cards like this, with this finger over here and the pinky over there and the 2 middle fingers on top. But I find that it creates such a big gap in front that I don't really like doing it that way. I actually have the first, second and third fingers on top and only the pinky on the bottom when I pull the cards to the bottom. Okay, now another tip that I like to give out to you special subscribers is the fact that the top half of the pack, a lot of the problem lies with the fact that it can't clear these fingers at the top. So these fingers tend to move around. And with a pass, this hand, your right hand, shouldn't move at all. It should hardly move at all. If possible, not move at all. So how I get around the fact that the fingers are in the way over here for this part of the pack is I pull this sort of backwards. I pull the top half backwards as I do the pass, so that it sort of clears those hands. Now, you don't see it too nicely from there, so I'm going to show you like that. So I pull them down, and when I'm pulling them down, I pull them this way as well. Okay, down and down. And when I'm pulling them down, then they're down, and then they're down on top of the down. Okay, so I'm pulling them down and down. So I'm pulling them this way and that way, sort of at the same time. So they go sort of diagonally as they're being changed for the bottom half of the pack. Okay, so basically that's what happens. So if they move down like this, they can clear these fingers nicely. Okay, and these fingers won't have to move to get out the way. It fits in there perfectly. So let's show you from this angle. Maybe it'll help if I can try. So you see that it's not at the top of the pack. If it was at the top of the pack when I'm pulling them, then these fingers get in the way at the top there. But because I'm pulling them down like this, the fingers don't get in the way. Let's try it again for you to see. I'm pulling them down at the same time, so these fingers don't actually move at all, and it ends up being quite a smooth move. So you could do the pass that way. So it doesn't matter if you get it fast in the beginning. All it matters is that it's smooth in the beginning. So when you're doing it, as long as it's smooth, it doesn't matter. So if you're turning and moving your hands or gesturing with your hands or speaking, and then all of a sudden you do it on an offbeat smoothly, nobody will detect anything, because the smoother you do it, the less movement is in this hand. All the movement is happening with this hand, and this hand sort of hides it. Remember that this thumb over here shouldn't move either. So when the thumb is there, it should move as little as possible. Shouldn't move at all, actually, if you can help it. So I try and anchor that thumb on the side of the pack or on the side of my fingers here when I do the actual move, so that I don't move that thumb as much as I can possibly help it. If at all, you shouldn't move this thumb and you shouldn't move this hand at all. All the action happens with these 4 fingers. And that's that. So just keep getting it smooth. Try and get it as smooth as you can, and you will find success in it. Whichever way you like to have a card returned, you could always have it returned and do the classic pass, and you'll have it on top. Remember, smoothness at first. Smoothness is more preferable than speed, because you don't want this funny movement of your hands to do this suddenly, because people will see it. Okay, What you want to do is just get it smoothly so that there's as little movement in your hands as possible. Otherwise, people will notice that something went down. And if you're good enough, you can even do the pass as a color change. The next move in the 4 workhorses of card magic is the classic palm. I think everyone who's a magician who's done card magic has done a palm or does a palm in more than one of the routines or effects that they do for their audience. A lot of magicians in the beginning are afraid of doing a palm because they feel that their hand looks dirty, or they rush to the pocket, or they feel very self-conscious. It's called thumb tip guilt. You feel guilty that there's a thumb tip on your hand. Meanwhile, nobody's looking, nobody cares except you. And your guilt is what actually telegraphs the fact that something is going on. And once again, you can practice the move at home as much as you like, but when it comes to performing and being comfortable in front of an audience, palming a card, that's only something experience can teach you. But you've got to relax. If your palm is convincing, if your palm is smooth, if you do your palm on and off beat like everything else, then nobody will notice that you are palming a card, especially if you're relaxed. Don't do the Lego man hand when you're palming a card. I see a lot of magicians do this kind of weird Lego man hand, or the gorilla grip, they call it the gorilla, or the crab claw. There's a lot of nicknames for it. But basically your hand has got to be relaxed, completely relaxed, when you put it by your side, or when you rest it on the table or on your lap or wherever. Your hand has to look relaxed, and you have to act as if you're not palming anything when you are. And that only comes with experience. Now, I'll give you a few tips and pointers on the classic palm. Then I'll give you a few tips and pointers on the palm that Dave Vernon liked to use. And it's slightly different in technique, but I find it a lot smoother and a lot more convincing, and there's not as much movement in the hands. So I'll give you a little bit of advice on both. I prefer Vernon's version of the classic palm, but you might enjoy the classic palm itself. But I prefer Vernon's version. Let's get into it and see what we can see or can't see. Now, the classic palm usually would happen after a pass, which is basically palming the top card in your dealing hand, or not your dealer's grip hand, but in the free hand or your dealing hand. So what would happen is it would use these 2 fingers, the middle fingers, to go on both sort of corners of the pack and then push forward to let that card go into a palm position. Now, this is a classic palm, okay, where you just push the top card into a palm position like that. Now, a palm grip, for those of you who don't know, should happen between the pinky and the base of the thumb, sort of diagonally across this way when you palm a card. You never palm a card with these fingers putting pressure on the card like that. That's what gives you that weird sort of Lego man hand and the weird thumb. But if you palm the card by just putting pressure between this corner and this corner, between your thumb and your pinky, your hand looks a lot more relaxed and casual. Okay, that's a tip for when the card is in palm. Now, I told you I would teach you what Vernon used to like doing, and what Vernon used to like doing is he used to only like pushing that corner with the pinky, the pad of the pinky, and at the same time pushing this card across with the thumb so that it would go into that position, so that a lot of the deck could be exposed while he's holding them and talking and handling them casually. Because when you suddenly do this, Vernon's reasoning was, if you suddenly did this and this, there's a very big movement. So even if they have relaxed attention and they're not burning your hands and watching the deck, they can see this move in their peripheral vision. But if you put pressure with the pinky, this hand doesn't move. If you push it with the pinky and with the thumb, at the same time. So you push with this thumb and push down with the pinky, and then it sort of goes into that position on its own. The important thing is this thumb is the only thing that moves there. This hand stays here, the rest of the hand stays there. It's a very relaxed looking palm, and it's very convincing if you do it smoothly. It's a lot better, in my opinion, to do a palm that way than it is to do a palm that way, because this movement is, Vernon was right, it is a big movement to sort of mask. You have to do that and that, whereas with his palm, all you did was one move like that. And it's a lot easier, actually, with a little bit of practice. It doesn't look like it, but it's actually a lot easier with a little bit of practice to actually get the palm into the correct position that you need. And the beautiful thing about it is you holding the deck with the card in palm like that, and it looks casual as ever. So you talking on the offbeat, you get the card in palm, you talk for a little bit more, and then you can put the deck down, and the card is in your palm, ready to be used. And I think that's a very good idea from the professor, and that's why they called him the professor. The next move is the top change. A lot of magicians know what that is, and like I say before, if you don't know what it is, you haven't been doing card magic for very long. It's basically where you switch the card you're holding in your right hand for the top card in the deck that you're holding with your left hand, or vice versa, depending on which hand you like to use as your dealer's hand or your dealer's grip hand. Now, you swap the top card of the deck with the card you're holding in your hand, the single card, by bringing your hands together and pulling them apart again. Once again, it's more about smoothness than it is about speed. And once again, you do it on the offbeat when the audience's attention is relaxed and when they're not focusing on your hands. You don't do it straight away. It's the same thing as the classic pass. You cannot practice it at home. And when I say you can't practice it at home, you can practice the move, but you cannot practice when to do the move. It'll be different for every group of people you perform for. So that's the kind of thing that only experience can teach you. I'll give you a few pointers on the top change. Once again, there's lots of things on the top change on the net, on YouTube and all of that. But I'll give you a couple of pointers on the top change that has helped me. And then hopefully it'll also help you. Okay, and now for the top change. It's not really a complicated move, and it's pretty obvious when you get to think of it. You basically holding a card like this that you want to switch, you put it on top of the deck and you pull out the bottom card like that. It's pretty obvious as a move goes, but if you practice it, and remember, it's like the pass, it's about smoothness more than speed. It's better to go slow and smooth than it is to go like this all of a sudden, because this looks like, you know, something's happening. And if you're talking and you go slowly and you pull your hands apart, it's a lot better than a sudden quick action. You're talking, you slowly do it, you pull your hands apart. It's a lot better than to do this, okay? That being said, if you practice getting it smooth, then the smoother you get it, the faster you will get it to a point where you can actually change it while you're talking and things like that. Just get it smooth. Another tip that I have for you guys is you do it on an offbeat, and I like to do it when I gesture. So I'd give someone something to think about, I'd point with the card, and then as I'm talking I'd say, what do you think? And that way sort of the gesture hides the move. Instead of just putting my hands together like this for absolutely no reason, there's got to be a motivation for me doing that. So the motivation for me doing that is to gesture. So I would say, what do you think that card is? Give it your best guess. What would you say? While I'm gesturing like this, it happens, the move. Now you might want to condition the audience by gesturing like this a lot, or gesturing like this while you're doing your routines, but it's not really necessary as long as it's smooth and you don't stall at any moment like you just saw. You got to actually get it very smooth. So smoothness, smoothness, smoothness. I keep preaching it. Smoothness is way better than speed. Okay, and with smoothness comes the speed. Now, another thing to remember is you need some sort of not only while you're gesturing, but you need some sort of cover. So I generally turn to the right when I'm doing a top change, especially for more than one person. And when I turn to the right, the deck is sort of at this angle over here. Okay, it's not at this angle over here. And the reason for that is because the top change is quite an obvious move. So if I turn like this and my hand is at the back, what ends up happening is my hand ends up being sort of like a shield for the move. And I like to keep this card horizontal with the ground and the pack as vertical as I can get it. Not completely vertical because that looks obvious. It's about there. And when I swap them, I put the card in, and when I pull out the card that I'm changing, it stays horizontal with the ground. So when I'm doing it and turning to the right, that's basically how it looks. I'll turn to the right, do the move, and then this is horizontal with the ground the entire time I'm moving. That way, it's got sort of like a continuation of vision, where people have seen the card in your hand like this. As you move around or gesture or whatever, the card is still in your hand like this. So if they look down again, they're going to assume it's the same card. Now remember, this happens during the offbeat as well. It doesn't happen while they're burning your hands. So that's why it's important to talk. Audience management is important, and that is the top change. Now I must admit that when they did the top change in the past, they used to let go with those fingers and grip it with these fingers. So you'd start between the thumb and forefinger, and then what you would end up with is letting go like that and ending it up between the index finger and the forefinger, which I don't think looks very good. Now the whole thinking behind that is that your grip doesn't change when you're doing gestures and stuff. And what you also have to remember is they were normally doing it for quite large groups of people when they would do a top change. Like Robert Houdin would do a top change before putting a card like resting against a glass or something like that, so that when he would snap his fingers or do the magical gestures, the card appears to have changed into whatever card he wanted. And in front of a large group of people, it's okay to do that grip sort of thing while you're talking, because nobody will notice, especially if you keep your thumb there. You're not going to do this, but if you keep your thumb there, no one will notice that you've actually changed grips from this grip to that grip. So while he was talking, he would do this, and then he'd put the card down or whatever. But I don't think that really works in such close quarters like we are used to, because sometimes people can be right up so close to you that you can actually smell their stinking breath. So that's the top change. I think it's about smoothness. It's not about speed. Speed will come, but only with smoothness. Smoothness is more important, but once it's smooth, it'll be smooth and fast, and then you'll find yourself, you're not in a rush to do the move, and it will just sort of happen automatically. Don't rush, just do the move in the offbeat. Now the last move that we're going to learn in the 4 workhorses of card magic is the classic force. Now there are so many forces out there that a lot of magicians sort of feel that the classic force is redundant, that they don't really need to learn it. Another thing that puts off beginners from the classic force is that it's not surefire in the beginning, and there's no way to practice it at home. Now, the classic force, in my opinion, is the most convincing, most natural force out of all of the forces possible today. I still think that it's the best force that a magician can use. Now, magicians get scared because they think, what happens if they don't go for the force card? If you don't know what a classic force is, you might have been living under a rock, but basically you're holding a break above the card that you want to force. You spread the cards out in front of a person's hand as they're taking a card, and you sort of time it so that that card is a little bit more exposed than all the other cards when you go past it, and thereby make them take the card that more of the card is showing. Basically, when you fan the cards out for them to choose, more of the card is showing that you wanted a force. Okay, now in the beginning, when a magician hears about this, when they're first starting out in card magic, they think, oh, but that's obvious. It's not really. You should see some of the magicians' classic forces out there. It's a thing of beauty. The way they speed up when the person is going to take a card, or they slow down if they see the person is still trying to decide. And as the person's hand goes to grab a card, that card that they want to force happens to be there right by their fingertips. And when you get good enough, you'll nail it every single time, the classic force. In the beginning, the advice that I can give you is practice the classic force every time you get someone to choose a card in the traditional way. If they don't go for your force card, just go into a different trick or routine. If they do go for your force card, you set yourself up with a duplicate somewhere or something for that particular trick you want to do and accomplish with a force. A lot of magicians would say, oh, but my cross-cut force is good enough. My Hindu shuffle force is good enough. Why should I learn? My dribble force is good enough. My slip cut force is good enough. Good enough is not good enough, really. If you think about it, do you want to be good enough, or do you want to be the best that you can possibly be? And I can say wholeheartedly that the classic force is the best kind of force you can possibly use. So, my advice, every time you get someone to choose a card the traditional way, do the classic force. If they don't go for your force card, do a different trick. But you'll see over time that more and more they will be going for your force card until eventually you can get it like second nature. So let's get into a couple of tips and tricks, including a Max Malini subtlety that I'm sure you guys will love. I don't know if you guys have heard of it before, but I've done quite a bit of reading in the history of magic and stuff. And this particular classic force subtlety is so mind-blowing, I'm sure that most of you guys out there will love it. So let's get into it. Okay, now the classic force. You have a break above the card you want to force. I want to force, say, the 3 of spades, and therefore when I want to force it, I do a cut, hold a break, and then I go and force the card on someone that way using the classic force. Now, the modern way of doing it is saying, take a card, take anyone you like, and then you speed up as they go there to grab the card, as they're going there with their fingers, because generally they'll stand there with their hand poised over. Now you can see that this card is the most inviting to take because the most of it is sticking out. And generally when you get the timing right, when you say, okay, what I want you to do is touch a card, okay, take a card there, and if you get the timing right, they will just go for that card. Okay, but like I said, it's a practice thing where you need to actually do it for an audience, and if they don't take that card, you just go into a different trick, that's all. So you get the break there. Now, normally what a classic force is, the real classic force, is you spread it like this, and then you tell them to choose a card, okay? And then this card is the one that is the most inviting to take because the most of it is sticking out. They don't want to the reasoning is they don't want to fiddle around with cards like that. But what I found is that these days people know that magicians can make you pick a card. They call it make you pick a card. They don't call it a force, right? So they know that some magicians can make you pick a card or take a card that you want. And it's pretty obvious if you're telling them, okay, take any card in that pack, which card that you want them to take. So generally, when they try and mess you up, they'll try and mess you up by taking a completely different card than the one that's most inviting. Most people do it that way. So that's why the best way to do it is to time it and say, okay, I've got a bunch of cards here. I want you to take any one you want. And just before they grab the card, you sort of put it in their hand. Just before they grab a card. That way, when they're seeing you go through the pack like this, it looks like you've got no control. But when you get to the card you want, you sort of put it in their hand. As they're going to take it, your timing will improve as you do it. You'll find that you might prefer to do a more shallow cut for this force so that the card comes up a lot quicker. I know I like to do it that way. But some people would like to do it in the middle so that they can push more of the card over like this as they're going, but it's up to you. My personal preference is to do it closer to the top, the card that I want to force. So I basically cut a little bit on top of it so that when I say I'm going through these cards, take any one you want, by the time I get there, they've already gone for a card. Nobody's waiting that long for a card, if that makes any sense. Nobody's going to wait for you to go through the entire deck like this before they take a card. Generally, they want to just see what you can do, and they don't want to waste any time. So I like to keep it close to the top. So take a card, and by the time they take a card, it's the card that I want them to take, because they've gone in very quickly. And it's a lot easier to time when it's shallow like this. If they let you go past the force card, if you say, okay, take a card, and they don't do it, don't be afraid. Just keep going and say, take anyone. You've missed the force, but then you can go into a different trick or routine, and they'll never know that you were trying to force anything on them in the first place. So that's all it is. Just a little timing, and then you'll be surprised at how quickly you can force a card on someone, and it is the most casual looking force that you can ever possibly find. Now, let's get into the Max Mellini subtlety. Mellini used to talk while he was performing a lot of the time. He was an Italian man. He had a big personality, and he used to talk while he was performing. And so what he would do is he'd get a force card, say the Jack of Clubs that he wants to force, and he'll be holding a break there, and he can put the pack of cards down like this, and it looks like he's just put the cards on the table, and they've like haphazardly fallen on the table this way. This is a very natural looking thing while you're talking and all of that. And then he would pick up the cards, and he'd be in a position where he can force the card from there without having to cut them again. So that was very clever of him. But another thing he used to also do when he would leave the cards, he'd leave them a bit untidy, so it looks, no one would suspect that anything has been done to that pack of cards, right? But that's the break you're looking for. What he would do, his own ingenious subtlety, is he would take the pack of cards like this, holding that break, okay, and he'd get the break like that, and he would throw them on the table, but with the break sort of open like that while he's throwing them. So he'd have the break open in his hands like this while he's throwing them, and he'd say, take a card. And generally what would happen, he practiced it so that this card would stick out the most at the break. So he wouldn't act like he cares which card you take. He would simply pick up the pack and throw it and say, take a card. And he'd turn around and talk to someone, and in the corner of his eye, he'd see if you're taking the card that he'd want you to. And that was the genius of it. If you had to throw a pack of cards and get the practice down, I don't really do it myself, but if you had to get the practice down where you're holding a break and a bit of a step in the cards like this, and you throw them on the table, the most inviting card should be the card that was at the break, because there's more of it exposed. So let's give that another try. Let's see if I can do this. Let's leave the king face up, and let's see if it'll work. If I leave a bit of a bridge and a step and I throw it like this, you see the king ends up being the card that is exposed the most. I left it face up so you can see more of this card is exposed. So if you pick up a pack of cards and just throw them on the table and turn to someone else and say, I want him to pick a card, don't look like you care which card they pick. Generally they will go for that card because they have to sort of do this and pull a card. They're not going to fiddle in a deck like this unless they're really, really being a pain in the backside. But if they are, just go into a different trick. But I thought that was a very clever, genius subtlety, okay, that some of you might get a lot of use out of. I read it in a dusty old magic book somewhere where he'd pick up the cards and he'd just say, okay, I want you to pick a card. Take anyone out, anyone you want, and he'd turn around and he'd look like he doesn't care. Meanwhile, the card that was at the break is there. Generally, people are going to take that card. I think that is a genius subtlety, and that's what made Max Mellini the legend that he was, is the fact that he could be so confident, and he'd know, like, if the mark missed or if the card wasn't taken, then he'd go into something else because he knew enough magic to actually get away with that, and so do you. So if you guys could use this kind of force, more power to you. I don't personally use it, but I thought I'd teach you guys that force. It's I don't want to call it the toss force, but basically that's what it is. The card that you want to force is the one that's more exposed when you throw the deck on the table. And that is that for the 4 workhorses of card magic. I enjoyed it. Don't know about you. So there you have it, the 4 workhorses of the old school magic, the original magic, the OG of magic when it comes to cards. And I hope you found something useful in there. If you didn't, I hope you enjoyed the tutorial anyway. I try and make them a little bit more interesting than a straightforward lecture on cards, because that can get a little bit dull and a little bit... So, please, if you've enjoyed this tutorial, like, subscribe, comment, share, all that good stuff. And I'll see you for the next tutorial next week.